there. Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Buino, and I am a psychotherapist here in Chicago and currently a NARM student. And I am so excited to share this podcast with you all. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. The Institute offers NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals who are looking for advanced training in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The neuroaffective relational model is a cutting-edge, innovative approach for resolving CPTSD, addressing attachment, developmental, relational, and intergenerational trauma. Hi! Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Transforming Trauma. I always say I'm excited to share interviews with you, and I truly am. But today's episode, I'm really excited to share with you because I had what feels like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but who knows, it may happen again. So I was blessed to be able to facilitate a conversation between Dr. Laurence Heller and Dr. Gabor Maté. If you are a person who works in the trauma field or you're familiar with trauma work, you probably know exactly who Gabor Maté is, but in case you don't, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Gabor Maté. So he's a renowned speaker and best-selling author and highly sought after for his experience on a range of topics from addiction to mind-body wellness. Rather than offering quick fix solutions to these complex issues, Dr. Maté weaves together scientific research, case histories, and his own insights and experience to present a broad perspective that enlightens and empowers people to promote their own healing and that of those around them. So this was a really exciting opportunity for me to share space with both Larry and Gabor at the same time. And I just am so appreciative for the both of them for taking time to sit down with us. And I really hope you enjoy this conversation between Larry Heller and Gabor Maté. Hello, I am sitting here with Gabor Maté and Larry Heller, and I am so excited for this discussion and to introduce you both to Transforming Trauma. Thank you so much for being here.
Nice to be here. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
The way that we often start this podcast is by asking our guests what they would like listeners to get out of this episode today. So Gabor, if you'd like to go first, any thoughts about what you'd like?
Sure. It'd be good if people had a clear understanding of what trauma is, because it's a word that's used quite broadly and may refer to any number of concepts that people have, but not necessarily agreed on. Number one. Number two, the complexity and the ubiquitousness of trauma in our society. And then thirdly, some possibilities out of it.
Larry, how about you?
Part of what I'd like to have people get out of this is the understanding that the trauma or the symptoms that come from trauma are not specifically from the event itself, more from the adaptations that individuals make to whatever event or series of events. That's what they carry forward into their adult life. And that's a different perspective than what I see out there a lot. And so that's one of the things, important things that I'd like people to take away.
And one of the reasons I'm so excited to have you both in this discussion is because I know both of your work pretty well, and I know that you both share a lot of these same ideas. So I'm nodding knowing that both of you can relate to these. So let's start off with how we define complex trauma.
Well, complex trauma is the word that is being used more and more. You know, it's a political decision as much as anything else. The World Health Organization is using that, you know, in the diagnosis that will be coming up, I think, in 2021. So I just use that as a synonym for many different things, which is developmental trauma, relational trauma, attachment trauma. All of those fall under the big umbrella of complex trauma. And so there are just a few things that characterize what we're calling complex trauma, and one is the chronicity of it. It's not usually just a single event. It can be, depending on certain circumstances, but overall it has more to do with relational dynamics in the family and in the bigger picture of the community and even the world. It is a catch-all these days, and the word trauma itself is being thrown around a lot. And I just want to emphasize that it's the adaptation and the way that we distort our sense of self and the sense of other in adapting to developmental trauma that really creates the difficulties that we experience as human beings.
Gabor, what are your thoughts?
I think, first of all trauma is complex. I don't even think there's single event trauma, in the sense that the same single event can happen to two different people, and one of them will be traumatized and the other will not. Why is one traumatized? Because there's already been some disorganization of their capacity to respond to a difficult event with resilience. So that even the single trauma, even if you can trace it to a single terrible event, which, often you can, and backs away, that makes it a lot easier to deal with. But even that will have some precedent. So that's the first. So I think all trauma is complex in that sense. Secondly, it's a question of what we define as trauma. For me, the essence of trauma is the disconnection from the self. And, Larry, in his book, Healing Developmental Trauma, he's got this 5 essential core capacities that we need. And anything that interferes with our capacity to fully experience those capacities, it represents a disconnection from the self. And therefore, in my definition, represents a trauma. So I completely agree with Larry. What I hear him saying is that trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you. And then the way you adapt to it is what happens inside you. So trauma itself actually is the system's defensive adaptation, so as not to re-experience those emotions that couldn't be handled the first time. So trauma is not what happens to you. It happens what's inside you, which is a good thing.
It is a good thing. You're right. I agree.
Yeah. Because if trauma is what happened to you, then let's face it, I'd be screwed because it happened 75 years ago. So but if trauma is what happened inside me, well, if I'm carrying it now in the present, then there's something I can do about it.
Well, as I'm listening to you, Gabor, I understand why people have seen a commonality in our thinking, because I could say exactly the same thing. I mean, the comments that you make are resonating with me.
And I see that in your book, which, by the way, I have 2 copies of, because you guys sent me one recently, but it turns out I either bought one years ago or somebody sent it to me years ago, because it looked very familiar when it arrived, and now I have 2 copies of it.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, Gabor, I know that you're doing work right now with compassionate inquiry. And so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about how you view compassion in terms of recovery from trauma.
Well, and I think, again, we're going to be in broad agreement with one another, but not just with one another, but I think the vast majority of the therapeutic field is that people have to experience a tremendous degree of safety in order to grow. Now, if therapy is just all about fixing somebody's ideas or getting them to understand the source of their pain, well, that's one thing. But if therapy's intention is that somebody should actually grow because trauma is a restriction, and now we want to promote growth, then what's necessary for the physiological growth of any organism is safety. And so when I talk about compassion, the work I do is called compassionate inquiry, and the inquiry part is obvious, but the compassion is the one that's important, because as Larry also points out in his book, people who are traumatized, whether what you call shock trauma or developmental trauma, they have a negative view of themselves. And so they keep attacking themselves. So there's no safety there. So the compassion actually is both from the therapist to the client, but also in supporting the client's own development of compassion towards themselves. Because as long as they're not, it's hard for them to actually grow because they'll be in defensive mode. So in a nutshell, that's what I say about compassion.
Yeah.
The only thing that I might add to that touches on something that you said. Part of the child's adaptation to trauma is to turn against the self. It distorts their sense of self. And so compassion is an essential capacity for growth, again, both from the outside as well as learning to develop it from the inside. And it bumps into those early distortions, which are there, in many cases at least, to protect the attachment relationship with the parents. And so they have an investment in not being compassionate with each other. And we run into that all the time. So those dynamics have to be explored before compassion can really deepen and settle. But I couldn't agree more that it's one of the core heart characteristics of human growth.
I'll give you my own answer to this, but I'm just curious to hear yours, because I've been teaching this for quite a while, that the self-hatred is actually adaptive. Mm-hmm. That's a hard one for people, although it's miraculous when they get it, what happens for them. Yeah. But you don't hear it much in therapeutic circles. So I'm just curious what your take on it. Like, why is it an adaptation, a helpful adaptation, as a matter of fact, the way I see it? So I wonder what your sense of it is before I tell you mine.
Okay. So there's the graphic slide there in the book about the distortions of the life force. And part of, at one stage there, is the splitting. And I've taken the psychodynamic concept of splitting and adapted it to my work. And basically what that means is that the child splits the parental image into the good parent and the bad parent, and the self-image into the good self and the bad self. They identify with the bad self in order to protect the image of the parent, which is more than just an image. It means they're really protecting that there still is the possibility of love in the universe. So there's a lot invested in seeing the parent as good and them as bad, because if they're bad, they can make themselves better. At least they have this idea. They can make themselves better and win love. And they do that, unfortunately, this is part of the paradox, by giving up and disconnecting from parts of themselves, the parts that they think are going to be welcome. So it brings this basic paradox into play.
So that's exactly what I like get people to is, okay, you're a kid, you're 3 years old, and your father was yelling at your mother. Which is safer for you to believe? That your parents are bad and they don't love you, or that they're incompetent and the world isn't safe? Or is it safer for you to believe that there's something wrong with you, that you're not good enough, that you're to be ashamed of? Obviously, it's unendurable for the child to even entertain the first hypothesis. It's much safer to turn on themselves and then hope to change themselves, but still believe that if I'm good enough, I'll be loved. So absolutely, absolutely. It's just that I haven't heard that from anybody else. And that doesn't mean nobody else says it. I just haven't seen that articulated.
Well, I haven't heard it either. So
okay. Great.
That's why I got you together.
Yeah. So again, I see why people have made connections between your work and my work.
That's great.
And you've already both pulled out some of the quotes of your work that I wanted to look at. So a couple quotes from Larry's book that I also heard you speak to, Gabor, when I saw you in Victoria in 2018. Larry says, an impaired capacity for connection to self and others and the ensuing diminished aliveness underlie most psychological and many physiological problems. And one thing you said in that retreat, Gabor, was that childhood trauma is at the core of illness and mental illness.
Well, it's only a fact. I mean, as a physician, I couldn't help but see it. And not only couldn't I help but see it, much to my amazement, I discovered that there's a whole research literature showing us not just a relationship in terms of association between childhood trauma in the sense that we're talking about it here, and autoimmune disease or malignancy or neurological disease or mental illness, but actually we even know the physiology of it. It's just that the medical profession doesn't look at that kind of evidence, which is astonishing because it's published in all kinds of scientific journals. And when I worked with addictions in what is North America's most concentrated area of addiction, every single one of my patients had been severely traumatized in childhood. Then they had multiple mental health challenges, of course, besides the addiction itself. And again, there's a whole lot of research. It just so happens that very few people put that research together. So my books have been about that. So one book is about relationship to childhood emotional stress, trauma, and adult stress, and physiological illness, showing all the pathways. And then my book on addiction, how the brain develops in the context of the environment. And when the environment is harsh, the circuitry of the brain that then benefits from the addictive behaviors or substances gets primed to soothe itself by addiction. I mean, Larry talks in his book, even when the mother cannot soothe the child, that distorts the development of the nervous system of the child. So it's just science combined with human experience. I've written books about it, and so has Larry. So it's just a fact, and I'm writing a new book now, and there's even more research now about how early trauma leads to inflammation in the body, which sets up the risk of heart disease and malignancy and autoimmune disease, how the functioning of genes is affected by early stress, including in utero. I mean, I think, Larry, you quote Rachel Yehuda's work in your book, and she showed that mother's emotional states during pregnancy has a physiological impact on the child later on, and how the genes functioning. I could go on and on and on. I'm just saying that the evidence is now beyond overwhelming. Right. And what's really lacking in medical practice is a connection between the evidence and practice. So there's a big science and practice gap. They keep talking about evidence-based practice. They don't practice it.
Yeah. Sure. How do you see us bridging that gap?
I think it's a process of educating people. For one thing, some of this science and the neuroscience and so on is, in the scheme of things, relatively new. But there is also a tendency for many people, particularly in the medical and psychological professions, to be reductive and wanting to oversimplify dynamics. And so they latch on, okay, well, it's neurotransmitters or it's brain parts. And we know that all of those are important. They're part of a bigger dynamic, but it's who you are. It's how you hold yourself. It's how you relate to other people, how you relate to the self, to the universe. These all affect neurotransmitters, brain parts, and we often put the cart before the horse in many of these dynamics. And I agree with Gabor that it just needs to be communicated. And it is evidence-based at this point, but it's just not widespread enough because some of the more mechanistic approaches, particularly in the psychotherapy approaches, have claimed the evidence-based mantle. And unfortunately for many people, I think, because I don't see them as more evidence-based than some other works we don't have so much, quote, data.
You know, in our society, basically anything that's superficial is going to be much more quickly accepted. So you take something like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, I'm sure it's got its good points, but fundamentally it's about changing people's ideas, where people's ideas reflect their emotional states, and their emotional states come from their early trauma. And I've talked to leading CBT practitioners and teachers who've never heard of the adverse childhood experiences studies, the relational trauma. Literally, I'm talking about very high up in that world. Here in Canada, the Ontario government has just announced they're going to spend $80 million to make therapy more available to the public. What kind of therapy? Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Well, just a little add-on. That's a kind of an interesting point. I read a quote from Aaron Beck, who's the father of this, and he says he relates currently more to psychoanalysis, he was originally an analyst, than he does to the highly protocolized CBT therapy. So I found that very interesting as well.
Listen, before we go further, I want to ask you a question, okay? Which has to do with how we talk about trauma here. So there's, the adverse childhood experiences studies and the 9 or 10 criteria. But what they don't mention, nevertheless, is the concept of attunement that you and I are well familiar with. And maybe your parents didn't beat you or each other. Nobody emotionally or sexually, physically abused you. Your parents didn't get divorced. Nobody was mentally ill. Nobody was jailed. Nobody died. Nobody was neglected. But your mom was depressed or anxious, or your parents had financial stress. They didn't have enough time to spend with you, and they sent you to a daycare before you were ready for it, and you missed them the whole day. And in other words, you can be negative on all the adverse childhood experiences and still be developmentally traumatized. Sometimes people use the word developmental trauma as anything that happened during the course of development, but when I use it, I mean anything that interfered with your development was a trauma. So I'm just wondering what your take on that is.
Well, exactly the same. And I talk about chronic misattunement and the price that we pay for that. And that can come from many different, some of the causes that you mentioned and others that we don't even need to go into, but that they're numerous, that affects the parent's capacity to be the kind of parent that the child needs. So again, there's a whole variety of life experiences that might go into that, but chronic misattunement is so underrepresented in studies, in the way people write and think about trauma. And I agree with you 100% that it's probably the most significant piece.
It's the most common one.
Yeah, and so since we're swimming in it all the time, we don't even recognize it half the time. And people only recognize it when they start to move beyond it, when they start to be able to attune to themselves or get attunement from a compassionate therapist, for example. Then they start to realize how distorted their sense of self has been, based on not any specific event, but the whole atmosphere and all of the whole dynamics of the family, the community, and even the world.
Which I want to get to at some point. Let me give you an example of what you and I were just talking about. So if somebody says they were sexually abused and they think that was the trauma, they're surprised to find out that I don't think, well, that was a traumatic event. Yeah, sure. Nobody's dismissing it. But the next question is, who did you talk to about it? The answer is going to be nobody, 90% of the time. Well, why not? Why would a child not? Because how did you feel when it was happening? I felt terrible. I felt afraid. I felt terrified. You didn't talk to your mom or your dad? Or you didn't talk to anybody? You didn't, well, why do you think not? In other words, that person, by the time they experienced that particular trauma, was already disconnected from their caregivers. And the abuser knew that because they can tell with laser-like accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's when it's coming from outside the family.
Yeah.
It's even more difficult for the child when it's coming from within the family. So when the sexual abuser is a parent, a grandparent, an uncle, a stepfather.
Which most often it is.
Yeah, so this brings up again the fear of the loss of the attachment relationship. They can't go there. And I agree with you again completely that there's nobody to deal with this, with whom they feel safe and comfortable to be able to talk about it. And there's another piece that I like to add too, which is that if it comes from within the family, particularly a parent or a step parent, we have to take into consideration not just the event or events themselves, but who that person is,
of course,
who is capable of doing that to a child. And that has much broader implications for us that either, and I tend to categorize these as narcissistic abuse and sadistic abuse. So when there's narcissistic abuse, it's like the child doesn't exist for the parent. They're just an extension, they're just to be used. Versus sadistic abuse, which has different dynamics. I won't go into them now, but this, what you and I are talking about now, I think falls into this category of narcissistic abuse, where you're not seen, you're not heard, you're not understood.
But in addition to that, let's say it's the father abusing the child. Well, where's the mom in all this? I'm not criticizing the mom. I'm just suggesting any mother connected to their kids will know when that child is suffering. The child doesn't have to say anything. There's a misattunement already, which is what facilitates the abuse. Doesn't cause it. It helps to allow it to make it to happen. Which means, why is the mom disconnected, misattuned? Because she's not attuned to herself. Why is she not attuned to herself? Because of what happened to her in childhood. In other words, as you imply, it's multi-generational. In both the case of the silent, oblivious, non-witness, or in the case of the perpetrator. But what I'm saying is that what allows it so that when you look at that trauma of sexual abuse, preceding that, there was already a trauma of misattunement. Otherwise, the sexual abuse could never have happened, or could have happened once, but not over days or weeks, or let alone years, as it often does.
So again, there's many different situations and many different dynamics, but I do like the way you bring this down to a person's inner world, their emotional states, and the bigger picture, rather than just looking at a discrete event and thinking that that's the answer to, and that explains the person's symptoms as adults.
And the reason why that's important is that people sometimes are in therapy for years trying to deal with the trauma of having sexual abuse, but they never get to the core trauma which preceded it.
Yeah.
With the intergenerational trauma, and since you both have been in the field for quite a while, I'm curious, why are we understanding more now? Is it simply just that we're developing better insights into therapy and the way that the mind works?
Of understanding intergenerational trauma, is that what you're asking?
Yeah. I feel like there's healing on a different level now than was available to my mom and my grandmother, right? And why is it happening now?
Well, I'm sure there's different ways. I'll just share a couple points and then pass it over to you, Gabor. But I've seen the way the whole trauma field has developed is that first there was awareness of what I would call shock trauma. That was like the returning veterans. And then out of that came some additional research on a number of different levels. And that was all important. And it also started bringing the whole idea of trauma or concept of trauma into people's consciousness more. And from there, then people started saying, this isn't enough. Mm-hmm. Why are some vets more traumatized than others? And then we start looking at, okay, there's bigger dynamics going on here. And I think that it's out of that first shock trauma wave that people saw that wasn't enough. And then we started saying, well, what is enough? What is it that we need to be able to address these dynamics? And that was then the current wave of understanding that is just in its infancy.
Well, it's certainly picking up speed. I mean, I just know that the interest in my work, the success of my books, and just people just want to hear what I have to say. It's part of a much larger movement, and we all know names who have been leading advocates of trauma awareness. But it's certainly picked up even in the last 10 years significantly. But what's interesting is that when you go back to Freud, his first awareness of mental neurosis was that it was trauma-based. This is back in 1895.
Before he changed his mind.
Before he chickened out. He probably couldn't deal, I don't mean to be pejorative, he just couldn't deal with his own trauma. I don't think, nor could he deal with the social friction and washback that he would have been subject to had he stuck to his guns.
Well, he was subject to it, and he didn't stick to his guns. He was subject to it.
Wow.
Right. But even that, I think, has to do with his own unresolved stuff, so the two are together. So then why was it forgotten all those years? This is a society in tremendous denial, is what it is. Mm. It's also society in flux. And I think we're seeing it now, certainly in the United States, we're seeing it, but we're seeing it internationally, that the world order that people had assumed was kind of secure and safe, and I think that was a false assumption, but it was fairly generally held, has not broken down. And as a result, we're looking for causes more. We're more willing to look more deeply, and the more people are willing to dig that much more profoundly into what's really going on here. At the same time, I agree, it's still in its infancy. I mean, it doesn't show up in medical work. It doesn't show up in psychiatry for the most part. It doesn't show up in most psychological work. For the most part, it doesn't show up in the CBT world. It doesn't show up in education. It doesn't show up in the legal system and political policies. I mean, we're nowhere yet, except to say that there's this burgeoning consciousness that is really welcome, and obviously we want to promote.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm optimistic because I am and have been connected and connecting to different groups beyond just the clinical psychotherapy field, so that I'm at least beginning the process of dealing with primary care physicians and pediatricians and school systems and those kinds of dynamics where a certain kind of trauma-informed understanding can help all of these different providers.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm seeing movements like that locally as well. Not in the medical school yet, but at least physicians are getting more information about trauma. Yeah, it's starting to happen. It's a good thing.
That's fascinating. So is there any specific hope that you both have for the future of work in the trauma field? What you'd like to see happen?
It's very simple. I just like to see this consciousness and this understanding continue to develop through work with Gabor's and my work and others that are, seeing things and trying to communicate these into larger and larger populations, and just the ripple effect that happens as we teach different people, and then they're clinicians, and then they work differently, and those people then have an impact on the people around them. So there is a ripple effect that does happen. And overall, I'm confident that will continue to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I second that. I mean, it goes back to the beginning. I'd like to have an understanding of trauma much more broadly absorbed on the part of society as a whole, but also on the part of specifically about anybody who works with human beings, like physicians, teachers, and let alone lawyers and everybody, and certainly therapists, for God's sakes. And secondly, in my view, if I could pass a law, if you don't understand trauma, you're not allowed to practice psychotherapy. You can coach people, you can be a friend to people, you can lend an empathetic ear to people. That's all therapeutic. But if you don't understand trauma, there's no basis for you doing deep therapy with people.
Yeah, and I would even add to that, if you're not truly interested in a person's inner world, if you just look at people in terms of their cognitions and behaviors, or just external dynamics, and don't really have a sincere interest in what's going on in their hearts and their bodies and their emotional states, then again, I think a person is disqualifying themselves for doing effective therapy.
Or to put it another way, if all those things are true about you, then you might really want to look at in what way am I disconnected from myself? So I'm not comfortable with other people's inner realities. What about yourself that you're not comfortable with? If you want to be a good therapist, boy, oh boy, that's the material to work with.
We're on the same page with that, because I spent a fair amount of time in my trainings around the whole countertransference dynamics and really getting therapists to look at their own dynamics, because until they know it in themselves, they can't see it or understand it in somebody else. So the personal work for therapists, from my point of view at least, essential.
Absolutely. And in my compassionate inquiry course, there's 3 levels. The 8 modules are repeated 3 times. People join the course thinking they're going to learn stuff, and they find the first 3 months they're working on themselves, which is really the basis, as I think we both agree, for everything else.
Yeah.
Have you gotten any resistance to that, Gabor?
Well, look, we give, in this particular online course, we give people 4 weeks. Are you comfortable with it? If not, you get your full money back at the end of 4 weeks. But I mean, people know my work. They self-select. I mean, it's not that we don't sell the stuff in the streets. So I'm sure with Larry's training, people that come to you will know about your work and they want to get deeper into it. So you might not find as much resistance as you would in a random mall,
Yeah. And actually, I find that out of this self-selected group, one of the things that they tend to value the most is the fact that we do that kind of personal work as an integral part of the training programs. It's easier to do, obviously, in live trainings, but we also have our online programs, and people are really drawn to it. And that personal change then leads them to become better clinicians.
Well, and that's what people say to me as well. And even when I just give live seminars or talks or the online thing, people say, well, I came here thinking I'm going to learn some techniques, but really I'm so grateful because I learned so much about myself that'll help me in my work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So listen, it's actually a rare to meet somebody quite as aligned as we seem to be.
And people have talked about your work to me for some time, and we've quoted you in some of our online webinars. But we really do seem very aligned here. Personally, I enjoy it.
If I can ask a question, kind of going back to what we were just talking about, because I'm in a position where I teach at a couple universities, and I do bump up a lot against students wanting to do their own work. And I just finished a term and was grading papers, and I had to read about CBT so much. I just wanted to gouge my eyes out. And what I intend to do with my students is really to just create an invitation for those who really are interested in doing their own work. Yeah. But I still find so much resistance. And I know that a lot of it is the work that I need to do in myself of letting go and letting other people have the dignity of their own experience. But I also wanted to hear from both of you what you thought about how can those of us who are bringing up the new therapists in the field, how can we really support that invitation?
It's a very useful thing to look at where we're coming from as therapists in all realms of our work with other people. Like to be asking that kind of question.
And, for me, that's a constant practice, because it has to be, because the fact is, I will not be 100% compassionate, present, attuned adult. I will not be. I can come close, but there'll be times when something happens, and then I got to say, well, who was I then at that moment that the other person experienced?
One of the things that I've tried to do, I've tried to build into the model certain kinds of orientations. And one is I discourage therapists from interpreting their clients. So it's much more inquiring. It doesn't mean we don't have working hypotheses around which we can ask more informed questions, but to assume that we have the right to tell a person what's really going on inside them, or what, for me, it feels so arrogant.
I have to say that I've done that at times. So I say, here's what I think is going on in you. If I do it well, it'll be received well and it'll be helpful. And if I do it blindly or arrogantly, it'll have a negative effect, for sure.
Well, for me, I just changed the languaging. I might have that same idea, thinking that I know, but I'll always ask it as a question. I'm wondering if, and then put it to them, so that then the person can sign on or not, and it's not me in this superior position telling them what's actually going on for them.
Right. Well, that makes sense.
And I can just share both personally in my own work in NARM therapy and in working with my clients in this capacity. I've found that since I've shifted to that, stop interpreting and start asking, that helps the client essentially create space for compassion that just naturally arises, where I don't have to apply anything. It just happens magically. So it's been really transformative for me. And this feels like a good place to wrap up. Any final thoughts that you want to share with our listeners? Maybe Larry, if you want to go first.
Well, I just enjoyed this so much. I knew, that there would be similarities from things that I've read, but it was really, I enjoyed it in a deeper way than I anticipated. Just the resonance that I feel between you and myself, Gabor, and sometime in the future, it would be nice to reconnect in a way where we could really talk. I would enjoy that.
Well, that'd be great. And, likewise for myself. Actually, would like to ask you a question for the benefit of purely selfish, nothing to do with this conversation, but your audience might enjoy it. I'm writing this book, The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture, which kind of expresses itself. The title explains itself. What I'm asking you is, mostly we restrict our therapy and our perspective to what happens in the family, which is important because that's where we all begin. But in a sense, the family is only a crucible for training to live in a much larger society. So the question I'm going to ask you is, either for you to answer now or for you and I to have a conversation afterwards, is what features of this culture feed into creating that traumatized self?
Well, you may remember that at the beginning, I made a point of saying the family, the community, and the world.
You did.
Yeah.
You did.
And so I see that too. And I even use the same word. Family is the crucible through which other elements are coming in. And of course, when I first started teaching in Europe, which was over 20 years ago, I was working with lots of people who were born in World War II. They're no longer in my trainings. But of course, they were impacted by not just their family, but everything that was going on in Europe at that time and in the world itself. And so we can't really ultimately, if we're looking big picture, we can't separate the individual, the family, and the community from the society and from the world and those kinds of dynamics.
So what are you seeing in this society right now? What are the dynamics on the whole that then contribute to trauma or keep it going?
I mean, there's a lot, of course, starting with the leadership, and you're in Canada, but I mean the leadership that we have in the United States, that's one element, but also he's just a reflection of a consciousness that paved the way for that kind of leadership. So it's kind of an easy target, but I see the theme of narcissism and how it's reflected in cultural interests and how that can be so subtle, how these parents who are trying to be the best parents and the perfect parents and build monuments to themselves through their children. There's a narcissism in there, even though their intentions, as far as they know, are the best. So I would put it, in this short time that we have, I would put at least this large rubric of the whole dynamic of narcissism.
Thank you. And perhaps you and I could have a conversation about that in a bit more detail at some other time.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. We are just so appreciative of this. I know the audience is going to love it.
Well, thanks for organizing it, Sarah. And thanks, Gabor. It was a real pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. For me as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website, www.narmtraining.com. If you're interested in what you're hearing and you want to move the conversation even further, we really encourage you to reach out to us. And social media is a really great way to do that. And you can find us on Twitter at NARM Training. So please feel free to reach out with us there, and we'll be really excited to connect with you. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.